David realized that as he walked through the valley of the shadow of death, he should fear every evil, for the men around him were evil. David also realized that if indeed money is the root of all evil, then the central bank must be the pit of hell and the devil's residence. But David also knew that corruption was a sin, and that the wages of sin is death. And although David Munyakei was in Kenya, he was in the midst of a scandal of biblical proportions. Unlike David of the Bible, who had to face one Goliath, David Munyakei was up against several Goliaths. It would have been an incredible tale had the ending been like that of David and Goliath. But for Munyakei, the Goliaths prevailed. Perhaps David regretted when he reflected back. Maybe he should have joined the fray and became filthy rich in his 20s. Or at least have kept quiet and kept his job at Central Bank. Because, as you will find out, if there is anything that is unrewarding and uncelebrated in Kenya, is being a whistleblower. It is seen as an offense worse than the scandal being committed. This is the story of the Golden Bag Scandal whistleblower, Sadera David Munyakei Oleshubai. Welcome to the Jeph Kafka documentaries. (1990) was a very eventful year for Kenya. President Moi had declared himself, at least in his mind, as a dictator for life. Robert Ouko was politically assassinated that year in February. The infamous Sabasaba rally happened in 1990 in July. And of most importance, the Golden Bag International Company was incorporated in 1990. In the same year, two boys whose paths would eventually cross but take two contradicting trajectories would be tied by the same fate. The first boy was David Sadera Munyakei. He was born in prison back in 1968. But that is not even the tragedy of his life. He was born in prison because his mother was a prison warden. David grew up in Olokuto, Narok County, in the abundance of nature, side by side with the world's most majestic cats, lions. So when every other Maasai boy wanted to be a Moran, David attended school. He passed his high school exams at Narok High School. David's story would have been normal and without notice had it not been for this other boy, his age mate. Different backgrounds, different fortunes, but as fate would have it, their paths would one day cross. Kamlesh Manuskal Damji Patni. He was born into a Hindu family, 1965. Like most Hindu families, his father was a businessman, a successful jeweler, dealing with gold, silver, diamonds, and all ornamental rocks. Patni had a good education and a first-hand experience in business. When both boys were in their 20s, in 1990, they moved to Nairobi, one to do business, the other to find a job. David, in his juvenile innocence, had no way of knowing what was happening around him. To be fair to him, not many of his peers had an understanding of economics and how governance worked. All he knew was the times were tough, and finding a job and getting a decent income was the way to go. In any case, he had already gotten an opportunity to join the army. He wanted to be a cadet. He had been used to seeing his mother in uniform, and that career path interested him. But when he got an offer to work as a clerk at the Central Bank of Kenya, he chose the pen over the gun. His sight was set on becoming a great banker. He started working there in November 1991. Patni was the complete opposite. An aggressive businessman who had learned a lot from his father. He knew how to deal in gold. Patni even knew the gold smugglers' paths from Congo. In November 1991, for instance, Kamlesh Patni was arrested with a consignment of 100 kilograms of gold he had smuggled from Bunia, Zaire. The cop who arrested him knew that the gold was smuggled and Kenya was being used as an exit route. But Constable Naftali Lagat was under intense pressure to release Patni. The orders were coming from above. Lagat defied the orders. He paid for late by losing his job. Patni was obsessively possessed to over-succeed his father. He had a bottomless abyss of an appetite for money, by hook, and, as in this case, by crook. The one factor that exemplified him from his peers was his sharp mind and irresistible charm. He knew about the economy, the current affairs, and his way around the corridors of power. He knew that the Kenyan government was about to liberalize the economy and to offer export incentives to businessmen.
I was just 24 years old. I was buying a suit in Nairobi and I met the director of intelligence. Then I told him about gold. I said, look, there's so much gold flowing through Kenya, but it's nothing Kenya is benefiting, it's not the gold. I said, I can create 500 million, every year from this if you do a proper license of this gold. So you took me to president.
Wow.
So at 24, I became advisor to the president, President Moi. So then he gave, exclusivity.
Meanwhile, David was coping well at the CBK. His development department was not that busy. He was a diligent clerk. He made a friend here and there. One was Mr. Kiambati. Mr. Kiambati had helped David adapt to the job and adapt to Nairobi life. His departmental head in the banking division was one Mr. Njoroge. Njoroge was a signatory of the documents that David was verifying. Another senior officer, Onyango Jamasai, would also play a role at his work in the CBK. In a nutshell, this was David Munyakei's daily routine. He would get vouchers from his superiors, verify that they had supporting documents, and forward them for processing. He would thereafter collect the processed vouchers for the day, file them in their respective files, and he'll be done. Life working at the CBK was more than a dream come true to him. At 23, he was already sharing the washroom with senior CBK and government officials. He'd then spend his evenings enjoying a cold brew on a terrace of a city bar. He would watch the long stagecoach buses pick and drop Nairobians. He would also join his peers in discussing the political mood that was embroiling the country. David's department was processing compensation for exporters. A complete CD3 form with evidence of duty paid was the mandatory documentation that David reviewed. He was also processing export finance, soft loans to enable exporters buy stock and distribute it abroad, but on condition of export order documents. They were numerous, but with little amounts. So far, everything that David did was according to book. Then, one day in June 1992, a new company's vouchers were dropped on David's desk. The amount excited David a little bit. He had not seen a request for such an amount before. The company had just deposited $500,000 into CBK after exporting gold and diamonds. David was excited that Kenya was finally exporting gold and diamonds. He was excited that Kenya was getting hard currency. The new company doing this was Golden Bag International Limited, led by a young Muhindi, Kamlesh Patni. When David first saw Patni, he just assumed that it was another Muhindi boy looking for someone in the building. But he observed further that his visits were regular, and the word going around among his fellow clerks was that Patni was going straight to the governor's office. The following day, he received another set of vouchers, similar high amounts, which he dutifully processed. For every dollar, he was exchanging for Kenya shillings equivalent plus a 35% compensation. That is, if the normal exchange rate was 100 for the dollar, Patni's dollars were exchanging at 135 shillings. But as the vouchers came in daily, he started noticing that the vouchers were repetitions of previous vouchers. Some did not even have corresponding export documents. He suspected fraud, but he was just a junior clerk, an entry-level employee with only 1 year's experience. He was a Maasai warrior at heart. He knew very well to listen to his instincts when he smelled danger, but the Moran in him was not yet ready to attack. But he chose precaution. This happened throughout the year 1992. Meanwhile, outside, the campaigns for presidential elections were heating up. The leading contenders were the incumbent President Moi and the leading opposition politicians, Matiba, Kibaki, Odinga. And when it was time to close the year, the CBK staff left for the holidays and the upcoming elections. As David left for Christmas of 92, he was a disturbed man. He had seen a lot of malpractice, and his bosses seemed eager to go on with it. But he left for his rural home in Narok. He enjoyed his Christmas by telling stories to his Moran peers about the city. He drank with them his favorite traditional brew. David even considered taking a girl from his community. But no local girl looked anything like the ladies he had seen in Nairobi. Girls with long exposed legs, sensual looks, artistry makeup, and sweet tongues. The city was slowly getting into David. Soon it was elections time. The general elections were held in Kenya on 29th December 1992. Voters elected the president and members of the National Assembly. They were the first multi-party general elections in Kenya since independence. Moi, as expected, won the hotly contested elections. Little did David know then that part of the money he had processed for Golden Bag International Limited was what was used to oil Moi's campaign machinery. The same money could have been used to finance the militia wing of the ruling party KANU, Youth for KANU wing. The only thing that David knew was that nothing had changed. Life would be the same, if not harder. David would go back to work in January 1993. He continued processing the payments. In his estimation, he had already paid Goldenberg International Limited close to 5 billion shilling in the past few months. Putney's company would deposit millions of dollars into CBK. Then a document purporting that the dollars were proceeds from exporting gold would be placed on David Munyakei's desk. The instructions from above were that the document be processed as they were, fictitious. The irony in David's office was that on the wall there was a big blue print-up of all the Kenyan exports. On it was coffee, tea, leather, French beans, wheat, sorghum, etc. But missing on that printout was gold. But the documents they were processing were for gold export. Knowing too well, Kenya has very little gold reserves, and a lot of its mining is subsistence, not commercial. The more documents he processed, the more malpractices he noticed. He noticed that even though everyone else he was working with was aware of the malpractice, no one was brave enough to say anything. This is when the moron within him started awakening. As David made copies of Goldenberg's export documents for his seniors, he made an extra copy for himself. This he did secretly. David would also request his superior, Onyango Jamasai, to allow him to work overtime. This allowed him to retrieve the copies from the files he had stacked in the shelves and put them in his briefcase. He did this every day until he felt that he had enough evidence to approach his superiors. David's conscience struggled to accept the theft as a normal practice. He chose to speak up. He first went to Mr. Kiambati, his fellow clerk and drinking mate. They discussed about the young Muhindi and his company Goldenberg, and how loads of money were being paid into his accounts. The big problem, as David confirmed with his friend, was that the documents being processed were the same ones, just photocopied and the dates whitewashed. Next, David approached Jamasai with the information. "You don't know what you are talking about," Jamasai had replied. "If I was you, I wouldn't touch it." David didn't understand that Jamasai's reluctancy was not based on complacency, but on fear. "Kotut ako kwa hii kitu," Jamasai warned David. Eric Kotut was the CBK governor, and he being in this thing meant that it was not to be touched. What David did not know was that Eric Kotut, as much as he was the governor, he was a low-ranking pawn in a scandal that was of biblical proportions. Kotut was acting on the directions of the Minister for Finance, who was also the Vice President, George Saitoti. Saitoti had, among other things, given Goldenberg International a monopoly to export gold. His office had authorized 35% compensation per dollar exchange into Kenya shillings. He had also allowed Putney to register and operate a bank, the Exchange Bank, in a record 2 months. Saitoti was in turn acting under the directions of the powerful Director of Intelligence, James Kanyotu. Kanyotu was Putney's silent partner at Goldenberg and Exchange Bank. Kanyotu was in turn working for the all-powerful klepto-statesman, Moi. Had David Munyakei known that the Goliath he was fighting had 4 heads, perhaps the moron in him would have retreated. Yet he chose to swing the sling and hoped that the stone would at least hit one head. David contacted Jamasai once again. After a few days, Jamasai's consciousness convicted him of the sins that he was now a part of. So he arranged to meet David at a popular drinking joint in downtown Nairobi. Jamasai arrived at the watering hole at around 8 p.m. He had dropped his official suit and tie for a simple jacket and a farmer's cap. He wanted to be as discreet as possible so that none of these would be tracked back to him. David was already at the bar with his girlfriend, Janet. David had already had a few bottles, and his overly brown skin was starting to turn pink under the dim lights. David had a narrow face on a slim body. His face was brown with a few shades of black where acne had once thrived. This brownness had caused his peers to start calling him Ole Shabai or Mzungu. Jamasai sat next to David. He ordered a malt and then proceeded straight to business. "I know someone who can help us," Jamasai said. "Who?" Munyakei wanted to know. So Jamasai whispered to his ears, "Muite na Nyong'o." Anyone who witnessed the opposition MPs of the 80s and 90s will agree with me here and now that the current crop of MPs aren't even fit to unloosen those alleged shoelaces. As you already know, after the 1982 failed coup on Moi tightened his grip on the country. The collagenization of the state and the one-party rule became the order of the day. Though there was no official opposition party in the 80s, a group of young MPs put their lives online to oppose Moi. Jonjo, the then powerful Attorney General, referred to them as the 7 bearded sisters. This was to demean them and possibly silence them. But thanks to their persistence, they birthed the next crop of the Second Liberation heroes. The 7 bearded sisters, Koigi wa Wamwere, Abuya, Onyango Midika, Mwashegu wa Mwachofi, Lawrence Sifuna, Chibule Watsuma, and James Orengo. Orengo's firebrand would transcend to the 90s. Others in the 90s included Gitobo Imanyara, Raila Odinga, Mukisa Kitui, Kiraitu Morongi, Paul Muite, and Anyang Nyong'o. This brand of fearless and fierce leaders existed when politics was a calling and not just a career. They included also clergy like Timothy Njoya, Father Kaisa, and Alexander Muge. Also journalists like Njehu Gatabaki. One of the classic episodes of these fearless leaders against the government of the day happened on 7th July 1990, the Sabasaba. This was supposed to be a political rally by the opposition of the day, but it was met with proper and brutal force by Moi's government. The GSU, or Fanya Fujo Uone, used tear gas to disperse the crowds and Mti wa Jembe to clobber the leaders. There's a video where you see Orengo being led away to a waiting police car. You can see from his work that his joints have been numbed, but he still keeps face for the cameras. an unbowing spirit. Then, as the officers who clobbered him pass by, one of them smiles at the cameras and gives a thumb up, for a beating well done. Perhaps it's because of this background that David and Jamasai decided to leak this information to Paul Moiti and Anyang' Nyong'o. They knew that these men would talk and cause heads to roll, and do it soon. That was in April 1993. As soon as the dossier leaked to the press, David Munyakei was arrested. In May 1993, as David was going on with his work at the CBK, he was summoned to the security office. The men he had cordially interacted with seemed to have no words for him when he got to the security office. "Tumeambiwa tukulete huku," was all that they said. Soon, a police car arrived and transported him to Kilimani CID headquarters. He was charged with contravening the Official Secrets Act. He was transferred to the Industrial Area Remand Prison, where he stayed from May to July 1993. Upon learning of her son's arrest, Elizabeth Sumbeyo, David's mother, would fall into depression, to so severe that she fell further into a coma and sadly passed away a month later. David was, however, released when his case was dropped by the AG, but ultimately lost his job. As much as the Goldenberg scandal was in the public eye, not many people could comprehend the magnitude of the scam or the structure of the plan. Its architects had hidden the blueprint with the same people who were supposed to be the guardians of the public coffers. But eventually, the export compensation and the pre-shipment credit incentives that Patton had used were stopped. It is therefore prudent to say at this point that David had eventually stopped a financial scam. He was a whistleblower and a wanted man, this time not by the law, but by the Goliaths he was trying to fell. So he escaped to oblivion. Not much is known of him after he left Nairobi for Mombasa, but it is known that he tried and failed in several jobs. He sank into depression. He watched as every one of the perpetrators' lives went on as if nothing had happened. His life seemed to have been stuck on a reverse gear. At one point, David even felt that the God of David had forsaken him. He had a spiritual dilemma and wondered what God to pray to. Eventually, he converted to Islam and married a Costolian girl, hoping that his life would be normal for him. As David languished in uncertainty, Patton was enjoying the lavishness that comes with $1 billion bank balance. He was living in Kitisuru, where he often hosted Governor Eric Kotut by the poolside, smoking Cuban cigars and popping a 1947 Cheval Blanc wine bottle. Patton used the proceeds of the scam to acquire the Grand Regency Hotel and the Pan-African Bank. As at that date, he had already received 5.8 billion shillings directly from CBK. 5.8 billion in 1992 is equivalent to 60 billion shillings in 2024. To put it in terms we can grasp, this amount is enough to pay all the 350,000 teachers an average of 25,000 shillings per month for 6 months. It's enough to construct 30,000 units of affordable houses at 2 million shillings per house. it's enough to give subsidies of 2,500 shillings per month to the over 2 million old people in Kenya for 1 full year. But all of that went to Patni and to his master's pockets. Yet, David and the other whistleblowers lived a miserable life. David's life was far from normal, so he decided to return to Narok to stay with his grandmother, Milka Wamboi Munyakei. From a banker to a peasant, all in the same decade. But wait, there was a glimmer of hope. Moi was finally felled by the NAG government in 2002. Then in 2003, a commission of inquiry was started to investigate the Golden Bag scandal, the Bosire Commission. But if you expect David to be the starring and give this podcast a happy ending, you are wrong. In a 408-page document containing the details of the scandal, David Munyakei's testimony is contained in a paragraph that is less than a quarter of a page. Although he received an integrity award from the government, it was not enough compensation for his heroics. He couldn't get another job at the government. He was still seen as a dangerous person to work with by the government officials. Hence, when he was proposed to work in the Governance and Ethics Ministry, his application got lost somewhere in a dustbin. So, David returned to Narok, a dejected man, a penniless man. Then, in the last days of July 2006, David contracted pneumonia, a treatable disease if correctly diagnosed and treated. But he was too poor to afford treatment. He passed on at the age of 38. Perhaps the last consolation is that David is in a better place, in paradise, sitting on the lap of Abraham, watching all the perpetrators begging for a drop of water to quench the fires of hell. For indeed, what doth it profit a man to gain the whole world and lose his soul? This has been Jeph Kafka. Until the next one, keep the faith.